Hi everyone, thanks for joining our webinar today on cross-curricular learning through STEAM. We've got a good session ahead today, which I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Oxford University Press acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Next slide. So to give you a quick overview of today's session, we're joined by the three authors and educators who've been working on Oxford's new cross-curricular STEAM projects. We're joined by Helen Sylvester, Katrina Davey and Edward Shin. And so today, Helen, Katrina and Edward are going to discuss some of our questions around STEAM, as well as hopefully some of your questions. We'll kick off the discussion today with Helen, who will give us an overview of STEAM, the design cycle and a little sneak peek of Oxford's upcoming STEAM projects, as well as some implementation possibilities. We'll then have our panel session with the team and open it up to your questions. So to introduce you to our panel, we have Helen Sylvester. Helen is director at the STEAM-focused Casey Tech School. She's been an educator for over 20 years and has held head of science positions in a number of schools. She was shortlisted for the 2014 and the 2017 Prime Minister's Secondary Science Prize for Excellence in Science Teaching in Secondary Schools and was Victoria's rep for the BHP Billiton Science Teachers Awards. We also have Katrina Davey here today. Katrina is a VCE history and geography teacher who has a passion for developing curriculum and has led humanities faculties at numerous Victorian schools. Katrina has a strong commitment to the History Teachers Association of Victoria, HTAV, writing VCE textbooks and examination materials, presenting regularly at conferences and mentoring history teachers. And we also have Edward Shin. Edward teaches physics and maths. He believes that pupils should learn about the magnificence of pure mathematics and science, as well as their social applications, and that rivalry between the pure and applied sides should not detract from education. His interest in both sides is shown by his stints in academic research, specifically astrophysics, and then in public policy, where he worked in transport and biotechnology before he became a teacher. Edward's also worked in exam development and assessment for VCAR. All right, so if you have any questions about STEM or STEAM, for example, around teaching or admin, please do ask them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'll hand it over to Helen.
Thanks, Kristen. So we're going to be looking today at STEAM and in particular cross-curricular learning. So in other words, how you can approach the whole concept of STEAM. Now, I tend to prefer STEAM because it incorporates the arts, but I'll explain more about that later. So I'll start with what is STEM, and it's always important to start with an actual definition. So this definition actually comes from VCAR, their frequently asked questions, and I checked it just last week to make sure that it hadn't changed. But essentially STEM is all about the science and the technologies, and the technologies includes both design and digital technologies. It incorporates the engineering and it incorporates the maths, and the whole key is that they're supposed to be integrated so students can see the overlap between them. And it also allows for those cross-curricular capabilities such as critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and usually in a real-world context. So I'm going to give you some examples of it as we move through. So why is STEM important? Why is the government concentrating on STEM so much? And it comes from international research that showed that 75% of occupations, or the growing occupations, require STEM skills and knowledge. Now, this comes from 2017, so it's still fairly recent, but this trend has been noticed since at least 2010. And Foundation of Young Australians, the FYA, in 2015 did some research on all the jobs that were being advertised across Australia. And they found that there was an increasing number of special skills that they called enterprise skills that were being requested by employers more and more commonly. And these included the critical and creative thinking, the group communication skills, all of those things that come under the cross-curricular capabilities. So as a result of these trends, in 2015, the Australian education ministers signed the National STEM School Education Strategy. Now that strategy is supposed to last 10 years, and you can see we're halfway through that strategy at the moment. So all the different education departments in the different states have recognised the importance of STEM and have increased the emphasis on STEM in their curricula. Now this, remember, is not just science and mathematics, but it's also those cross-curricular skills and those approaches to this combination or intercurricular learning. Next slide, please. Now we can break this approach down in two ways. We can look at project-based or problem-based. Often they are called PBLs, but they are slightly different in their approach. So the problem-based learning is all about the process that students go through. Students are presented with a real-world problem, and they work through a design cycle to try and come up with a potential solution. And the focus is often on the skills that they acquire to get to that solution. Again, the cross-curricular capabilities. Project-based tends to be a little bit narrow, where problem-based can end up with a wide range of possible solutions. So you can have a whole class of students all working on different things. Project-based means that the students tend to work towards the one similar project, and along the way they might be developing particular skills that are linked directly to the curriculum, and so there's a little bit more curriculum content involved in project-based learning. So I'm going to give you examples of both, and it's one of those things that we, when choosing our problems, we took into account whether or not they were project-based or problem-based. Next slide, please. So I thought it's also really important to think about what is the design cycle. The design cycle is a process that mirrors quite closely to the science inquiry cycle. It's a set of tools that guide students on how to work through this problem or project-based solutions. So first of all, they'll spend some time discovering the particular content, and this is the chance to cover some of those content knowledge that students need to know. So those teachers who are a little bit worried about whether or not you'll be covering the content that you need to cover in the curriculum, this is your chance often to preload some of that and to provide, it's also the empathy stage where students will be working on understanding how different people in the community experience it, which comes into the personal and social cross-curricular capabilities. Once they've discovered and found out a little bit of knowledge around the problem, they will often need to redefine the problem in the way that identifies the group of people they're trying to help, because problems are usually very broad. Once they've defined the problem, they'll go through the rest of the design cycle of ideate possible solutions. Then they might build a prototype solution. And once they build it, they need to test it. And I always think it's important to test the first model to breaking point. It then removes students' temptation to just try and add more to it. Once they've tested it to breaking point, they go back and rebuild again. So not just building one model, but building multiple models. Once they've refined their model a number of times, then they'll communicate their solution. So you can see there's quite a lot of skills in this, and you can do it in a short time period of, say, a week, or you can spend a whole semester working on the one particular type of problem. And again, I'll give you different examples of this. Now, the other key thing with the design cycle is the cross-curricular capabilities that are an essential part of the curriculum that all teachers need to be able to teach. And they are the critical and creative thinking, the personal and social skills, intercultural skills, so bringing in, looking at different cultures and how they experience the problems in different ways, and also the ethical, which I think is often forgotten. And for me, that can be encapsulated by saying, just because we can, should we? So just because we can solve a particular problem, should we solve that particular problem in that way? So thinking about the whys of something needing to be done. Next slide, please. So I thought the best way of giving an example would be to use one of the ones that we've put into the textbooks. So these STEAM projects are actually in the science textbook, the humanities textbook, and the maths textbook. So it crosses over all of those. And the example I'm going to use is one aimed at year 9. So the problem, we've defined the problem, and I know one of the biggest difficulties for a lot of schools when you're wanting to implement it is working out where things overlap. So the goal was to make it really easy. And because I work in a STEAM centre where we produce a lot of these sort of programs, and I talk to teachers all the time, they just are not quite sure where to start, where those overlapping curriculum ideas are. So the example I'm going to show you is the real world problem of how can we use sustainable farming practices so that no one goes hungry in the future. So then there's the pre-learning, which is the discovery part of it, and making links into each of the textbooks so you can tie into the humanities, tie into the maths, tie into the sciences. Now, where we've focused students in this particular one is a project-based learning, where students are encouraged to build a vertical garden. If I can have the next slide, please. So the vertical garden that the students are going to do is they're encouraged to define the problem. They go through each stage of the design cycle specific to that problem, and they will then hopefully build the vertical garden. Now, there's a number of different ways to implement it, because as I said, one of the difficulties when you're trying to implement it, you just don't know where it fits in, or it's hard to know how to involve other teachers in other areas. So I've put together some little examples which might suit each of you in different ways. The next slide, please. So there's, as I said, multiple different ways of doing it. So the reason why I prefer the term STEAM, because that's the true mixing. I find that if you use the word STEM, then it sets up a bit of conflict, an artificial conflict between the humanities and the English and language subjects and the other science, maths and technology subject teachers. And that is a very artificial area or artificial barrier. It doesn't need to be there. So one of the key things is you can approach this a number of different ways. Multidisciplinary is when you keep the individual curriculum areas and you specifically mention, okay, so in science, for example, we're going to do a little bit of maths, we're going to do some graphing, this is how you do it, and you make that link to the maths, often quite verbally, or just getting to model something they might have already done in the maths area. In the humanities, you might be doing something along the lines of pyramids if you're studying Egypt, and you might talk about some of the science behind the building of the pyramids, for example. Or you might talk about, there's a lot of overlap in year 9 between food security and the ecosystems that happens in year 9. So those, you mention them in their individual classes, but there's no real crossover between them. The cross-disciplinary is sometimes you might have the maths teacher and the science teacher work together and teach a joint lesson, showing how the maths and the science overlaps, or you might have the humanities teachers and the digital technology teachers developing a digital technology solution to a humanities curriculum area. Interdisciplinary is when you start having teachers working together a little bit more closely, and I'll give you an example of that. But the true transdisciplinary is when you're actually combining all those key areas into one group of lessons, and the benefit is that is students see the links. They get deeper learning, and as a result of that deeper learning, they're more likely to remember it. So let me give you actual examples rather than the theory. Let's look at an actual example. Next slide, please. So this is the multidisciplinary approach, and sometimes that's a separate STEM class. Sometimes it might be in a design technology class. Now remember that I've used the example of how can we look at, let me go back to my actual problem, how can we use sustainable farming practices so that no one goes hungry in the future? So if you're in a STEM class or if you're in a design technology class, you might look at food production in the local area at the same time that humanities might be studying it. So the geography teachers might be talking about food sustainability approach. You might look at the current technologies that are available in the local areas. You might look at emerging technologies as solutions. Now, these are all key things that are in the design technology curriculum at Year 9. Then you start going through your design cycle. So let's define the problem from a number of people's points of view. Once you've defined the problem, then you're going to go into the ideation stage, what possible solutions they are. You might spend some time actually doing testing of different types of materials. You might then build your vertical garden from the materials that you've tested. Then you've got to test your models to see if they work. You might then need to go back and rebuild again. Depending on how much time you have in those STEM classes, you repeat that cycle a number of times. You might produce models. You might produce actual real vertical gardens that can be used in the school grounds. And then, of course, the final stage of any design cycle is always the communication, where the students need to present their design process, the different iterations, as they're called, so the different little models or samples that they developed along the way, take photos of them, be able to talk about the different stages. So that's a multidisciplinary, where you keep your individual curriculum areas, but you try and emphasize that overlap between them. So the next one that I've got is an interdisciplinary model. So this is where you have the teachers are starting to work together, but you might decide you want a STEM program for 1 week in a semester. And in that week, you want to look at the different curriculum areas that you covered during that first part of the semester. So you cover your curriculum as per normal, and then on that 1 week, you have all the students all working at once just on the STEM, tying everything together. So there's that overlap of skills of all of them with all teachers working together. You might spend a day, first of all, taking the Year 9s out for an excursion to some local agriculture in the area. It might be a market garden. It might be a number of different things. Then you might come back and you might talk about the climate change and how climate has changed the types of gardens and plants and growth that you've had since then, as over the last 20 to 30 years. So you might have someone come in and talk about the history of it, plus someone talking about the science of it. Then the second day, you might spend some time ideating possible solutions and get students to start building their models. And of course, as part of that, you might tie in with the maths, such as ratios and scale factors, because if they're building a model, they'll need to take that into account of the scales. So then they might, day 3, they'll have to do testing of it. They might have to do a little bit of maths tying in surface area and volume of the soil and water, because that will determine how heavy the vertical gardens are going to be, even in the modelling stage. So they need to think in terms of the strengths of them. They need to think in terms of the volume of 1 litre of water equals 1 kilo. So therefore, how much of it are you going to have to be able to support? Of course, that testing, the key part of that is, I always encourage students, test the first model till it breaks. You need to break that first model, because only then do they learn from it and rebuild. So they have to rebuild on the beginning of day 4. Maybe you'll go through most of day 4. They'll need to embed some testing into it. They'll need to think about the numbers and the types of plants. If you've got a big vertical garden, you're not going to grow big tall trees on each one of them. You might only be able to grow small lettuces, for example. So they'll have to do some calculations in there of the number of plants that will be involved. And then you can have a display day on day 5, invite the parents along, and you can have showcase everything that they've learned for the semester, that are all joined together in this final STEM project. Now, this is, as I said, the interdisciplinary model. There is one other example that I've put together, which is the true transdisciplinary. And it's worthwhile thinking about this. You're not going to go straight to this. So mainly because it takes time to train up the teachers to do it. So before you go into something like this, it's better to try joining a couple of curriculum areas together. So get the maths and science teachers together, get the humanities and the maths teachers together. You both are in both sets of textbooks, so everyone knows where they're heading from, and try a small one first, because teachers need time to try it. It can be messy from time to time, and that's okay. And that's why it's best to try it on a small scale before you go to the big one. But I thought I'd show you the big one because I know there are some schools out there that are actually thinking and starting to work in this space. I know of at least 2 in the group of schools that I work with who are working in this space. Now, I've color-coded this so you have some idea of how it all works together. So for the maths teachers who are out there, you're looking for the light blue to show the types of maths that's embedded into the program. Humanities, you're looking for the paler orangey colour, and science teachers, you're looking for the yellow. I've also put in there colour-coded the different parts of the design cycle. So this is where you embed the actual teaching as part of this whole unit. So you'll start off with some humanities, looking at the agriculture and in the area and the factors that affect agriculture, such as soil moisture, water resources and soil types. So all of that's taken directly from the VCAR curricula. Then you might do a bit of science because there's an overlap between the humanities and science, very much between the biotic and abiotic factors. You've already covered the abiotic factors, so you need to have the biotic factors such as parasites, competition, pollinators, disease. You talk about how the whole ecosystem is affected. Then if you're going to start evaluating particular areas, you need to look at area of composite shapes. You need to collect data. You need to be able to display that data effectively. Then you start looking at agriculture around the world, the whole environment. And you can see you're providing a lot of that discovery section of it by covering those key curriculum points. Then you have some ideation. You have some ratio and scale factors because whatever they build, they have to think about ratio and scales. Then you will have a couple of sessions on building, and that will extend out according to how much time you have. Then you're going to bring in the surface area and volumes of it. You'll test and rebuild. You can do that a number of times. Once they've built their models, they'll need to think about Pythagoras' theorem to tie in with the shadows that are generated. How close together can the vertical gardens be? Then you'll do some more testing, and then you might have communication either in terms of a report or in terms of a presentation. So you can see there's a number of different approaches. You need to start small because it's really scary when you start. And having been on this journey myself, in either learning myself in my classrooms or trying to get other teachers involved in a department and then try and get other departments involved, it has to be a stepwise procedure, and you need to have the support from your school leadership team. Something like this, I've designed it where you have cover the key factors across the curriculum areas, but tying in with approximately 3 lessons of math, I've got 5 lessons of maths, I've got 4 of the humanities and 4 of the sciences. So you're covering those key curriculum areas, but they're applying it all the way along. So it gets that deeper learning. So they're not just having one class of composite shapes. They're going to be using that composite shapes when they're doing the building or when they're analysing how effective it is. So they're going to keep coming back to that a number of times. The next slide, please. So one of the key things thinking about when trying to develop up this whole project was to think about how many we needed for each year level. And given that there's project-based and problem-based tends to be a bit broader, tends to be more open-ended. Students can come up with multiple different answers. Project-based, they tend to come up building the one type of project. So what we tried to do was to have both one problem-based, one project-based in each of the textbooks. And remember, the same STEAM projects are in the humanities book, the science book, and the maths book. So that means that all teachers have the potential to have access to these particular STEAM projects. Next slide, please. So the types of problems that we've put in there, again, they're very broad problems, and you notice they have a very similar approach. It's how can, so that. So the reason for doing that is it's all about having a problem. So how can, this is what they need to do, so that that's the reason why they need to do it. So it's all about encouraging teachers to think about that. So it's water was one of the common ones that shows across a number of curriculum areas. So we needed to include that. I thought was a nice little overlap. Another big overlap is reducing waste to not exploit resources, because resources is a common curriculum element. Year 8s, I know a lot of schools already run energy efficient housing, so this allows you to tie in specifically with the different areas of the curriculum for the teachers. So rather than just being a science project, it can be a science, humanities and maths project. It can be a true STEAM project, and a lot of students are also doing design technologies in year 8, so it ties in the design technology. Bring those teachers in with you. It's also how you can use technology, because digital technology, so the impact of natural disasters is reduced, because natural disasters, again, a common curriculum element that you might not be aware is in multiple curriculum areas. Next slide, please. Year 9, I mentioned the sustainable farming practices, so that was a project one, so looking at everyone building a vertical garden, but a problem-based one is how can we harness technology so that we can live healthier lives? So that is one of the things that is much broader, and it's a problem because teachers, students rather, can come up with multiple answers to that. We haven't steered them to one particular thing. If you're trialing this for the first time, strongly recommend you go for a project-based rather than a problem-based. It's just easier to contain. You know what the outcomes are going to be. It also makes it a little bit easier in assessment because you know where they're heading, so you can assess certain elements. So year 10 are a lot broader again, because a lot of these students, we wanted them to think both nationally, so how can Australia reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, but also globally. How can we use technology to improve the lives of people globally? Again, it does tie in specifically with curriculum areas, even though they look like really broad problems. They're broad for a reason, because as soon as you give students a chance to select one element of it, it then gets student engagement. So you've got higher student engagement. However, it does become a little bit more difficult because it becomes so open-ended. Some students and teachers, for that matter, do get a bit lost. Next slide, please. So that's the reason why we're putting together a whole lot of digital support. So guidelines for teachers, guidelines for students, for those students who have never done it before and those teachers who have never done it before, designing through a stepwise process so that you know how it ties in with the curriculum, what sort of questions you can ask the students to help encourage them, or nudge is the word I use, to nudge them in a particular direction. We're going to have examples of assessment criteria and marking rubrics as well. Now, none of them will be perfect. The whole idea is you will modify them for your cohort, because you as teachers know your cohort much better than what we can do. Our goal is just to provide you some support so that you have somewhere to go and you know where you can do. Remember, key thing is to start small and then build it up. So start small the first year, go a little bit bigger the next year. You do the design cycle yourself. So you've got to build it, then test it 1 year, build it and have another test the following year. Next slide, please. So this is a chance to hand over and your chance to ask questions of us of what it could look like, our experiences. We've had a little bits of experiences, and certainly Katrina and Edward will be able to give you more information on the humanities and the math sides of it.
That was an excellent lead into our panel, I think, and I do have a few pre-prepared questions to throw at you, and then hopefully we'll see some more questions in the chat for us to open up in a moment. So my first question to you is, what are the opportunities of STEAM from a teaching perspective? And I was hoping to ask Katrina to give us a humanities perspective first.
Yes, thanks, Kristen. Well, look, the first big opportunity, I think, for all teachers is the valuable professional development. It really is a chance to organise team teaching or professional learning teams within your school, a chance to initiate teacher observations, which we know is a very important thing today, that principals are really desperate for us to watch each other teach, and working with other faculties. Teachers can even learn content knowledge from each other that could improve their own teaching. So maths teachers could learn some economics, geography teachers learn more about statistical methods, and they'll then see how much all the subjects overlap. And finally, it would definitely assist you if you have to do teacher appraisal or performance review criteria. Usually there is something where you have to either watch another class or work with another teacher. So STEAM is a really fantastic way to tick off that element of a performance review. Yeah, but I can also talk about just humanities as well. There are many wonderful opportunities in humanities. Firstly, for history teachers, it's a great way to incorporate the many depth studies and topics that you cannot possibly cover in your own subject, especially Year 8, which has about, I think, 9 depth studies to choose from. So when I was looking at all the different topics and when we came up with the list, I sort of have seen connections you could make. But also, even if you had your own project, for example, I know at a past school I worked at, they were doing a solar panel, they had a STEM class and they were doing a solar panel boat competition where they had to try and get it across a pool of water. And I thought to myself, well, that could have tied in with studying the Polynesian expansion and the importance of canoe building and how sacred it was to those people. It could have been like the beginning intro lesson to the history of building canoes. Also, if you're doing fantastic flying machines or something, you could always bring in the Renaissance and Da Vinci, or some anatomy and how it started during the Renaissance, or even some astronomy with Copernicus. So, and in Year 10, the environment movement, which will basically fit almost any topic that we've got today, the environment movement, which is not often covered for Year 10 teachers who struggle to even get enough time for history in Year 10. So that's how it satisfies history teachers. Economics and civics, well, it really is a chance to cover both of them in Year 7 and 8 by co-teaching with science or other faculties, maths. If you can get a STEM class up and running, that would be even better. It also is a chance to drag in those VCE business faculty teachers that we know who love to sit up the top end in BizMan and economics and legal studies in particular. They always like to sit up there, accounting teachers too, and say, you know, you can be part of this, come in and help us in the middle school with our STEAM project. Year 9 and 10 economics and business electives that often have that entrepreneurship aspect where they have a market day or they have to create a business. Well, maybe we could base that around the STEAM projects. So instead of just doing some frivolous thing where you're selling lollies to school kids, maybe we're actually making it purposeful and a real world issue at the same time. Now, finally, the biggest opportunity for anyone is the geography teachers. And we all know that you are fighting the fight to just get back in the timetable, especially in Year 9 and 10. So I do think STEAM could be your entry point to raising geography's profile, especially if you are struggling to get a VCE class up and running. By having the Oxford textbook on hand, you might be able to go to your principal and convince the leadership team that, look how relevant it is, let us come be involved in the STEM phenomenon that is taking over schools everywhere. I would push to turn it into STEAM and incorporate the geography curriculum. All of our topics completely involve geography. They are mapped perfectly to it. And I just think that this is the opportunity you've all been waiting for. Geography teachers, we are the absolute hardened warriors of fighting just to get a lesson in for geography. So I would make the most and push for STEAM. So yeah, there's my way of helping all humanities teachers.
Definitely a huge consideration. Well, I might get Edward to have a crack at this question about what are the opportunities of STEAM from a maths teaching perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina and Krista. For maths, I think the one thing maths teachers need to be absolutely clear on is that STEAM is not a replacement for many things that are taught in maths that need to be explicitly taught. And I think Helen wants to say more about about that later. The STEAM is an opportunity for pupils to use the skills that they've learned and see that those skills can be applied to what I might call genuinely real-world problems, as opposed to the fake real-world problems that they will be used to seeing in maths class from previous years. Right? And all maths teachers know what the fake real-world problems are, where you have what's essentially a simple geometry problem, but instead of a rectangle, you've said it's part of a fence. Right? It could have been a rectangle. Not so with the STEAM problems. And I think what they learn now is not the math skills, but what we might call the conditional knowledge, the knowledge of when to use a particular mathematical procedure or a particular piece of factual mathematical knowledge when it's relevant. And that allows them to experience some success in not just the skill in drill, but success in applying what they normally learn in maths to something that does seem real and relevant. And I think that's worth something as well.
Yeah, that was a good answer, Edward.
and there's one other thing I wanted to say actually, and this comes as a with my physics teacher hat on as well as my maths teacher hat on. Many pupils seem to be pretty hopeless at estimating and checking whether their answer is reasonable. And STEAM is the ideal context for them to practice those ballpark estimation strategies.
And what about you, Helen? Have you got anything to add on to this from a science perspective?
From a science
perspective.
From a science perspective, there's a lot of science overlap in all of the problems, but for me, it's the science as a human endeavour. So the science is a human endeavour, applying the science in real-world context and applying them, understanding when and why they should be applied, or as Edward said, in terms of the maths, of knowing when to apply your science knowledge, when to apply the maths knowledge, when to apply the humanities knowledge. That is incredibly powerful. Everything else will stay behind in the classroom. If you remember when and how things are going to be applied, that's long-term knowledge in true context. That's the depth of knowledge, and that's what we're really after.
I feel like you already answered this a little bit, Helen, when you were talking about sort of the transdisciplinary approach and where explicit teaching fits in. But where in the STEAM project, how does the explicit teaching fit in?
So this is always the one that you come up against with a lot of teachers, because they think it's an either or, and it's not. So when we're talking about explicit teaching, we're talking about those high impact teaching strategies, the HITs as they're sometimes called. Explicit teaching is one of those where you have your learning intentions, you have your success criteria. Those are still there, and that's one of the reasons why I put together that timetable with the true transdisciplinary, because you have those explicit teaching lessons where you're teaching the ratios, you're teaching the biotic factors in environments and ecosystems, you're teaching about the local agriculture and the reasons behind it and the how soil impacts on it. They can be explicit classes, and often they're what I call the preloading information or the discovery part of it. So you still have the explicit teaching. It's really important to understand that it's not a free-for-all, just tell the students to go and build a vertical garden. That's the last thing it should be. You've got to scaffold the learning, which is why that's one of the reasons why I wanted it in the student textbooks, so students can see the scaffolding, but also some of those hints and resources for teachers behind the scenes as well, of knowing when and how, little techniques that will make things easier.
I definitely had some feedback from people in the past about, not being so keen on STEAM because it felt like it was another thing to do in addition to teaching the curriculum rather than as part of, or incorporating it into. Sorry, so Katrina and Edward, please feel free to let me know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, look, I just have to say that the one thing that has really stuck for me was something that Helen just mentioned once about, you know, students do not know what they don't know, the unknown unknowns. And I just think that is exactly the right thing to think about here, because in humanities, you know, we can, you know, there are people who do death by inquiry where it's like, well, how the students don't know anything about the Industrial Revolution, so how can you send them off and go, just come up with your own questions about something that happened? You know, it'll just be who, what, when, where, why, and then they'll finish, you know. So you have to have the explicit teaching to make some known unknowns, so they actually have some basis and context of what they're going out to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That's good. Yeah, we've had some brilliant conversations. I'm really glad that people are actually able to be a part of it. And so I'm going to flip it a little bit and ask very differently to the first question. So what are the challenges of STEAM from a maths, humanities, science perspective? And Edward, I'll make you go first with this.
I think for maths teachers, the biggest challenge is just going to be getting maths teachers on board, because it's different to what they're used to. And I'm wondering if maths teaching has changed perhaps the least compared to many other subjects over the past decades, centuries, I don't know. So it's different, and so maths teachers will need to adapt. They'll have to become comfortable again using rubrics if we're assessing it, and maths teachers did have to deal with rubrics in the 90s in Victoria because of the cats, and then I think most teachers were happy when those rubrics could disappear. And it's just getting used to a different way of doing things, and also accepting that in STEAM, maths is going to be one of the enabling disciplines. It's not the lead discipline that determines what the project's all about. It's a set of skills that are essential for the students to complete the project successfully, but it's there in that supporting role. And if maths teachers can accept that maths can be a supporting subject as well as an important subject in its own right, then it should work okay.
What about humanities, Katrina?
Look, for humanities, often the main thing I have heard is that teachers worry about assessment protocols. You know, how are we going to assess them? How do I report on this? How do I assess when it's all just group work? You know, that kind of the fear of what I've got nothing on that one student. And also for humanities, it would be how do we incorporate some of our hard skills like a source analysis or certain types of mapping. Though I don't think geography has anything to lose here. I think that they could incorporate all of their skills because the content is so perfectly matched. But yes, they would be the main issues. Also even maybe literacy, that would be another one that would, how do we bring in literacy just to really, you know, make it more difficult for you to come up with answers. Yeah. Yes. I'm not saying I have the answers to all these. Helen, you might have more idea on how to answer those kinds of questions.
I know this is things when I've struggled with over the years because there's no one answer. There's multiple answers depending on the project. I've done a number of different things, from formative assessments I find are the most powerful. So rather than have that big one summative task at the end, have those number of little goalposts along the ways to check their understanding. So you can have the mini deadlines, for example, going back to the vertical garden, you could have a mini deadline that they need to present their initial draft of how much the vertical garden will weigh and how much what sort of strength it will need to have. So tying in with that maths formative assessment, tying in with the local environment would be tying in with the defining the problem. So with the humanities and that pre-learning is, can they define what the problem is by analysing the different types of plants that once were available in the local area and being able to analyse why those plants were available, the types of soils that had the best growth for those types of plants, and coming up with resources along the way. So that part of that definition part would then be your geography assessment. So you can have those little formative signposts along the way which become the assessments rather than the big final project at the end.
And we've got a question from Matthew. He asks, when would be the best time to complete these STEAM projects, at the end of the semester, year, or is there a timeline for each subject to make it all link up in a timely manner? And we've actually had Carolyn Drennan start us off with a response saying, I find STEAM projects work well after a unit or as an alternative for end of term activities in science.
Well, I've done little mini versions of them. So the beauty about these ones is you can do them just in a curriculum area. So let's say you work in a school where you have your different silos and no one talks to each other. They sit in different parts of the classroom, or different parts of the staff room, for example, and they just don't talk to each other very much. If you're in a school like that, start off with it just in your individual curriculum area. So whether it's the humanities one, whether it's the maths one, whether it's the science one, you can do a mini version of it at the end of the unit. And then you might find that you've got a friend in the humanities area, and you just try and rejig your timetable so that you're teaching the similar content at the same time, and potentially you could have a similar task that will accumulate into a final STEM project. So you go for those little successes early so that you can then build it up. If you've got a school leadership team who are willing to support you and are willing to give you a week in the timetable, do at the end of the semester or the end of the year, depending on how many weeks you can get out of your timetable. These are the things that it has to be flexible, because not every school is the same. So start small. Make sure you get some successes first, then start talking to your colleagues, dragging them in, and potentially your leadership as well.
Got any tips on winning over your school leadership team, Helen?
School leadership teams, I find, are often much easier than sometimes some of the departments. Some of the departments do like to sit in a separate corner of the staff room. From personal experience, and I'm not going to name the departments concerned. However, what I found is that I started having the conversations with the particular teachers, and I did initially, to get some of them interested, I said, well, can we just do a class swap? This was one of the areas, so it was a number of different areas, but one area was the design technology area. I said to the teacher, can you come across and give the design aspect of how do you approach a design? I'll take your class instead. So we just did a direct class swap. And once they saw that there was huge potential for it, the following year, then I was able to get them involved in a little bit greater detail. So they became involved in, I asked their advice on how can we implement it more effectively, which then caused them to share some lessons on a little bit more individual basis. So it was a bit sneaky in that way.
That little step-by-step that you were talking about. Planting the seed. I just had another question through, how do the teachers from different faculties to Mark 1 assessment cut them into parts? Oh yes, how would you go about cross-marking, I guess, across departments? And Carolyn's been very helpful today. Her suggestion is to use one rubric and use your school learning portal to copy and paste in each domain involved. What do you guys think about that?
I like that idea. What does Katrina think and Edward think?
Well, I mean, there would definitely be, I guess it depends. There's no way humanities teachers could probably mark anything to do with the maths or science. Like they would probably shy away from that. So I would see that you could still have one rubric, but like if it's to do with the context or the start or the knowledge behind it, then that would probably be like it might be the first part of a project or a submission or a draft or something that the humanities teachers, they would tick off that part of the rubric. But, you know, when it comes down to other parts like the design or skills, that kind of thing, that would probably be maths or science. Yeah. I can't see a history teacher, usually history/English teacher, really wanting to touch weights and volumes of a vertical garden myself. But You never know, though. Some people love the chance to do something else that they have a secret talent in. So, yeah.
I'm going to second what Katrina says, but also throw a bit of a spanner in the works. I think it's a bit cart before the horse. I think that the assessment, how we work out how to do assessment, especially summative assessment, that's something that we can work out later after a school has decided how they're going to implement it. And I'm thinking back to Helen's grids about the many different ways in which STEAM could be implemented across subjects, between subjects. The assessment is something we can worry about later, especially if we look at the importance of formative assessment. That formative assessment could be about discrete, smaller parts leading up to the big product at the end, and those discrete smaller parts can be within just one or two subjects rather than across all of them, I think. And summative assessment at the end, worry about it later, or not worry about it at all if you don't have to.
I just had a good comment from Deirdre, who says it would be good for students to see teachers discussing and covering other subject areas, overcome the barriers between subject areas. I totally agree with that. I think that would be an amazing benefit of sort of that collaboration. And totally. I think I do think we are running out of time though, so I'll start to wrap things up. Can we get the next slide, Ella? Thank you everyone for your questions today. If you do have any feedback for us or any more questions, you can still get in touch with us. We do like hearing from you. And I'll also just mention that we are publishing there are 3 new series for Victorian curriculum this year where these STEAM projects will appear. So we do have Oxford Science with 7 to 10 curriculum available soon. Next slide. Our maths publishers are currently working on a new series for Year 7 to 10 maths that has some brilliant print and digital features to support individual learning pathways. And of course, we had our Humanities 7 to 10 series, previously known as Big Ideas Humanities, but now it's just called Oxford Humanities series and has a great skills focus. The other thing I want to say with today's webinar will soon be available as a recording via our website. So if you did miss the start or if you missed the end, we'd like to share this with somebody else. You should receive a link to the recording in an email after the session, or you can visit our oup.com.au/PD for any of our past webinar recordings. And if you have any questions about anything today we've discussed, including the STEAM projects, please do get in touch via oup.com.au/contact. And Helen, I'm not sure if you want to do a quick plug for the tech schools in the area, which are a great resource for STEAM.
Yes, so if you're lucky enough to be in the local area for one of the 10 tech schools, so the one that I'm at, Casey Tech Schools for the Casey region, there are tech schools Ballarat, Bendigo, Monash Tech School, and I can't name them all, but Yarra Valley, all of them. If you're lucky enough to be in that area, then please make use of them, talk to them about their approaches to STEAM. It's something that we provide free teacher PD and everything else for teachers outside our areas as well. So if you're ever interested in free teacher professional learning with STEAM, come and talk to any of the tech schools.
Definitely do it. I went and visited Helen at Casey Tech and it was the best day of my year. So I would highly recommend you all get in touch with your tech school if you're lucky to be. All right, so thank you to everyone for attending. We hope you found today's session useful, and a huge thank you to Helen, Katrina and Edward for sharing their insights today. It's always brilliant to hear the 3 of you discuss STEAM, and I'm glad we could share a bit of that with others today. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope you have a lovely evening and stay safe. Thanks very much.